The central accusation made by Blake Lively and her legal team hinges on a claim that intimate scenes discussed or drafted during the production of It Ends With Us were inappropriate, gratuitous, and not supported by Colleen Hoover's novel. This claim, when examined against the actual text of the book, collapses almost immediately. Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us is not restrained, subtle, or ambiguous in its depiction of intimacy between Lily Bloom and Ryle Kincaid. While the lawsuit attempts to frame intimacy as a deviation introduced during film development, the novel itself establishes sexualized dynamics early and reinforces them repeatedly. One of the most explicit and memorable examples is the playing doctor sequence, an episode so exaggerated and cliché that many readers remember precisely because of how over-the-top it is. In the book, Ryle Kincaid arrives wearing medical scrubs, complete with a stethoscope. This object is not incidental. It becomes a focal point of a sexual role-play scenario in which Lily Bloom explicitly engages with Ryle's identity as a doctor. The interaction does not remain flirtatious or suggestive. It escalates into a prolonged, graphically described sexual encounter involving explicit physical actions, sexual positioning, and physiological detail. What is critical here is not where the scene takes place, but what it represents. In the novel, the playing doctor fantasy occurs in Lily's floral shop, not in a hospital. However, the sexual content itself is explicit and unambiguous. The book does not merely imply intimacy. It describes it in detail over several pages. This includes the use of medical props, verbal sexual role-play, and full sexual contact. Against this reality, the lawsuit's framing of proposed or discussed hospital-based playing doctor scene as inherently inappropriate becomes logically inconsistent. The film adaptation did not invent the sexual dynamic. It inherited it from the book. Justin Baldoni's deposition testimony clarifies that when the creative team revisited intimacy between Lily Bloom and Ryle Kincaid, they were repeatedly returning to the novel to understand how to translate its tone into a film that was constrained by a PG-13 rating. The book contains far more explicit material than anything that could legally or commercially appear on screen. As a result, adaptation necessarily meant reducing, not amplifying, sexual content. This is where Christy Hall's role becomes essential. According to testimony, the specific dialogue involving flirtation between Lily and Ryle in a hospital setting originated during collaborative writing sessions with Christy Hall. It was not secretly inserted by Justin Baldoni, nor was it framed as a finalized scene. It was part of an iterative process responding to multiple pressures, including studio notes from Sony requesting that the sexual dynamic between Lily and Ryle be clearer and more distinct from Lily's relationship with Atlas. The lawsuit attempts to isolate the hospital setting as proof of impropriety, but this argument ignores two facts. First, the book's sexualized doctor fantasy already exists. Second, the film version removed the explicit sexual behavior entirely. There is no sex in a hospital exam room in the movie. There is no nudity. The characters remain clothed. The tone is restrained to comply with rating restrictions. The argument that the hospital setting itself makes the concept gratuitous relies on a selective moral framing rather than textual honesty. In the book, Lily Bloom and Ryle Kincaid engage in explicit sexual activity in a place of business, a floral shop, after hours. If the standard is location-based morality, the book is far more transgressive than the film ever intended to be. This contradiction exposes a major flaw in the lawsuit's logic. The same dynamic that is condemned in the film's development process is defended, minimized, or outright denied in the book's characterization. Colleen Hoover herself has publicly suggested that her novel does not contain excessive sexual content, a claim that is difficult to reconcile with the text. The deposition reveals that when Blake Lively expressed discomfort with a hospital playing doctor idea, the scene was removed. This fact alone undermines the claim that Justin Baldoni was forcing sexual content against her wishes. The creative process adjusted in response to her feedback. That is not exploitation. It is collaboration functioning as intended. What the lawsuit does instead is retroactively reframe the existence of the idea as evidence of wrongdoing. This reframing depends on the assumption that the idea itself was abnormal. But the idea came directly from the novel's tone, structure, and character dynamics. Lily Bloom and Ryle Kincaid's relationship in the book is deliberately written as highly sexualized, impulsive, and physically charged. That sexual intensity is narratively necessary to explain Lily's emotional confusion later in the story. Removing or denying that aspect fundamentally alters the character logic. Justin Baldoni's testimony explicitly states that the creative team was attempting to maintain this distinction. Lily and Ryle's relationship as sexual, Lily and Atlas's relationship as romantic. This is not an invention. It is a core element of the novel. By claiming that discussing sexualized interactions was inappropriate, the lawsuit indirectly argues that the book itself is inappropriate, or that it was never properly understood by those adapting it. Yet the adaptation team demonstrably returned to the book repeatedly to guide their decisions. The most damaging aspect of the lawsuit's position is that it assumes audiences and courts will accept a sanitized version of It Ends With Us that simply does not exist on the page. Anyone who has read the novel knows that the book's playing Dr. scene is more explicit than anything contemplated for the film. In short, the sexual dynamic was not introduced by Justin Baldoni. It was not invented by Christy Hall. It was not demanded by Sony in a vacuum. It was embedded in Colleen Hoover's text from the beginning. The attempt to portray this dynamic as a predatory addition rather than a restrained adaptation is not supported by the evidence. It relies on selective quotation, strategic omission, and the assumption that the source material will not be scrutinized. Once the book is placed back into conversation honestly, the foundation of the accusation begins to crack. The issue is no longer whether the film introduced gratuitous sexuality, but why the novel's explicit content is being ignored to sustain that claim. This disconnect between the book's reality and the lawsuit's narrative sets the stage for every contradiction that follows. The next phase of this dispute centers on how it ends with us transition from page to screen and who shaped the script during this process. Justin Baldoni's deposition and the records from production illuminate the reality of how scenes were proposed, drafted, and modified. The process highlights collaboration, adaptation constraints, and studio influence, all of which are ignored or misrepresented by Blake Lively's legal team. Initially, Justin Baldoni was tasked with translating Colleen Hoover's novel into a screenplay that would be cinematic, audience-friendly, and consistent with the PG-13 rating target. From the outset, he was not working in isolation. Christy Hall, a seasoned screenwriter, was responsible for crafting dialogue, proposing scene structure, and maintaining fidelity to the novel while balancing the limitations inherent in film production. During early meetings at Baldoni's office, Hall worked closely with Justin to identify the novel's core sequences that needed to be adapted. The playing doctor idea, for example, arose in these sessions as part of their effort to retain Lily and Ryle's sexual tension without exceeding content restrictions. Multiple scenes were discussed, tested in draft scripts, and either revised or discarded based on practical considerations, including location availability, budget, and the actors' comfort levels. Sony's involvement was a critical factor throughout the process. As the studio financing the project, they had both commercial and creative stakes. They requested certain narrative beats to emphasize the romantic and sexual tension between Lily and Ryle while differentiating it from Lily's relationship with Atlas. This instruction was not unusual. Studios routinely provide notes to ensure the film meets marketing and audience expectations. The deposition makes clear that the hospital version of the playing doctor's scene, which became a point of contention in the lawsuit, was not originally scripted by Justin Baldoni. Instead, Christy Hall suggested adjustments to fit the studio's requests and production constraints. Baldoni then shared these drafts with Blake Lively for her input, treating her feedback as part of the iterative process. The scene's removal or modification occurred after her objection, demonstrating that no content was being forced against her wishes. Multiple collaborators were involved in shaping these sequences. Christy Hall provided the original suggestions. Alex Saxes, Andrew Koff, Janetti, and Jamie Heath were part of the writing and revision process. Their roles were to ensure that the dialogue, staging, and tone reflected both the novel and the limitations of a PG-13 adaptation. The legal claims that Justin alone inserted sexualized content misrepresent the collaborative reality. Budget constraints were another significant factor influencing script decisions. Hospital sets are expensive to rent, and the production schedule limited the number of scenes that could be filmed there. Studio executives and producers were constantly evaluating how to balance these financial realities with narrative needs. When the playing doctor concept emerged, it was partially a solution to maximize storytelling value within restricted locations. Importantly, all discussions of intimacy were overseen by an intimacy coordinator. This professional ensured that scenes were appropriate, consent was clearly established, and the actors' boundaries were respected. Baldoni consistently relied on the coordinator's guidance to translate the book's sexual content into film-safe sequences, respecting both rating restrictions and actor comfort. Despite these safeguards, the lawsuit frames these ordinary production decisions as evidence of misconduct. It selectively isolates conversations from their collaborative context, implying that the mere existence of draft discussions indicates predatory intent. The deposition, however, showed that these discussions were structured, documented, and subject to approval at multiple levels. studio, director, writer, and actor. Moreover, Justin Baldoni repeatedly referenced a novel during this process. Every decision to add, remove, or modify dialogue and scenes was cross-checked against Colleen Hoover's original text. The adaptation aimed to maintain fidelity to the book's emotional arcs while compressing or censoring content that could not appear on screen. This is standard in adaptation and directly counters claims that sexualized elements were invented to serve personal motives. Another key point revealed in Depositions is that even minor dialogue choices were debated collaboratively. When Christy Hall suggested specific lines or beats, these were tested with actors, read aloud, and revised if they did not serve the story or they caused discomfort. Blake Lively had the ability to request changes, which she exercised in some cases. This demonstrates that content was never imposed unilaterally by Justin Baldoni. Finally, Sony's influence illustrates a larger truth. Creative decisions are rarely solely artistic. They are commercial, logistical, and ethical. Studios weigh audience reception, actor safety, location costs, and narrative coherence. When a legal claim suggests that Justin alone decided on content for personal reasons, they ignore the multi-layered checks and collaborative review process that characterizes professional filmmaking. In sum, the adaptation process was a negotiation among multiple stakeholders: Justin Baldoni as director, Christy Hall and other writers as scene creators, Sony as financier and studio, and actor providing input on comfort and character portrayal. Allegations that sexualized scenes were introduced solely by Justin for nefarious purposes disregard this reality and distort the collaborative context into a false narrative. As the deposition transcripts reveal, one of the most contentious points in the lawsuit is the so-called hospital scene, which the plaintiffs argued demonstrates misconduct or gratuitous sexualization. However, when examined carefully, the transcripts expose a pattern of contradictions, selective recollection, and misrepresentation that fundamentally undermines these claims. Justin Baldoni's testimony makes it clear that the hospital setting in question was never meant to be literal or explicit. It was a proposed adaptation choice to translate the sexual tension from Colleen Hoover's book to a film-friendly environment. The original playing doctor seen in the novel occurs in Lily Bloom's floral shop, a private space that allowed for highly explicit interactions between Lily and Ryle Kincaid. The scene in the book involves role-playing, a stethoscope, and full sexual contact, none of which were included in the final PG-13 film adaptation. During the deposition, Baldoni repeatedly emphasized that the hospital version of the scene was a compromise, a symbolic representation of intimacy, not a literal reproduction of the novel. This nuance is critical. The lawsuit frames a discussion of a hospital-based scene as inherently improper, but Baldoni's testimony establishes that the creative team was actively adjusting the scene to meet rating guidelines, budget constraints, and actor comfort. Moreover, the testimony reveals a misalignment between Blake Lively's statements and the actual authorship of scenes. The lawsuit asserts that Justin Baldoni inserted sexualized dialogue to serve personal motives. However, Baldoni clarifies that the dialogue in question was largely authored by Christy Hall, a professional screenwriter tasked with adapting Hoover's text. Lively, according to deposition records, was informed about these drafts and had opportunities to provide input. When she expressed discomfort with certain lines or settings, adjustments were made accordingly. This creates a clear contradiction. On one hand, the lawsuit claims that Baldoni acted unilaterally to introduce sexual content. On the other hand, the deposition establishes that Christy Hall wrote or co-wrote the dialogue and scene concepts. Sony, the studio, requested adjustments to emphasize sexual tension without explicit content. Blake Lively had review rights and could request modifications. All proposals were filtered through professional oversight, including an intimacy coordinator. The misrepresentation becomes even more apparent when comparing the hospital's setting in the draft script to the floral shop in the novel. In Hoover's book, Ryle Kincaid wears scrubs, uses a stethoscope, and engages in fully explicit sexual activity with Lily. The lawsuit's framing implies that the hospital concept was gratuitous, whereas the novel already includes more graphic sexual content than was ever filmed. In essence, the plaintiffs are portraying the adaptation as inappropriate while ignoring that the original book far exceeds what was intended for the screen. Another area of contradiction involves the so-called climax scene and the sexual interplay between Lily and Ryle. Baldoni testified that these moments were carefully choreographed in consultation with the intimacy coordinator to ensure appropriateness. He also confirmed that any conversations he had with Lively about these scenes were professional, centered on actor comfort, and often involved direct references to the book. The legal claims, however, recast these interactions as evidence of predatory behavior, a reframing that ignores a documented oversight and iterative feedback process. The deposition also addresses authorship explicitly. When asked whether specific lines or ideas were Baldoni's creation, he clarified that they were mostly Christy Hall's. This undermines the repeated claims that he added sexual content for personal motives. It also exposes a lawsuit's selective omission. Rather than presenting a nuanced chain of authorship, the plaintiffs simplify the process to a single narrative, one that falsely attributes intent and malice. Credibility issues compound when examining Lively's statements across multiple platforms. She has at various times attributed scene creation to Justin Baldoni, to herself, and to the writing team. These inconsistencies are critical because courts rely on factual consistency. Contradictory accounts weaken the strength of claims, especially when a defendant's deposition provides clear documentation of collaborative authorship and oversight. Another factor in the credibility issue is the misrepresentation of book fidelity. The lawsuit implies that sexualized dialogue was invented for the film, when in fact the book already contains graphic material that the adaptation sought to tone down significantly. The deposition confirms that Justin and his team referred to the source material frequently, adjusting scenes to preserve character dynamics while remaining within production and rating limitations. Finally, the deposition reveals that the legal narrative often relies on subjective interpretations of discomfort or embarrassment rather than objective violations. For example, when Lively reportedly expressed that she would be mortified by a scene's dynamics, Baldoni clarified that this was a personal comment reflecting how she might feel in her private life, not a statement about the professional appropriateness of the adaptation. Yet the lawsuit frames this subjective response as evidence of misconduct, ignoring the clear context provided in testimony. The culmination of this controversy extends beyond individual scenes or legal disputes. It highlights the broader impact on how Hollywood adaptations are perceived, the long-term effect on the reputations of those involved, and the risks inherent when narrative control is manipulated in public discourse. One of the most significant consequences of the lawsuit against Justin Baldoni, and by extension the scrutiny of Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds' involvement, is a distortion of audience perception. Public statements, media soundbites, and legal filings often reduce complex collaborative processes into simplified narratives. The hospital scene controversy, for example, is consistently portrayed as a case of unilateral sexualized content being forced onto an unwilling actor. In reality, as the deposition transcripts clarify, every stage of scene development involved consultation, collaboration, and adherence to professional standards, including guidance from Christy Hall, Sony, and an intimacy coordinator. When narratives are simplified for public consumption, there's a risk of permanent reputational damage. Justin Baldoni, a director known for a professional approach to intimacy coordination and actor safety, is now subject to public scrutiny framed by selected quotations and misrepresented motives. Similarly, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds' credibility is tied to claims that are demonstrably inconsistent with the documented creative process. The audience, however, rarely has access to deposition transcripts or the behind-the-scenes nuance. As a result, public opinion is shaped by headlines and sound bites, which often emphasize drama over fact. This situation also underscores the challenges of adapting source material, especially novels that include graphic sexual content. Colleen Hoover's It Ends With Us presents explicit scenes that are integral to the characters' emotional arcs. Attempting to moderate these scenes for PG-13 audiences introduces a tension between fidelity and accessibility. When legal claims reinterpret these adaptation decisions as morally or professionally inappropriate, the industry risks sending a chilling message. Any effort to modify or translate content may be construed as misconduct, even when the changes are made collaboratively and with professional oversight. A critical long-term implication lies in how this case might influence future adaptation projects. Directors, producers, and writers may become excessively cautious, fearing that faithfully representing a novel's content, especially sexual content, could result in personal or legal attacks. Studios might prioritize controlling narratives and limiting creative input from directors or writers, reducing collaboration in favor of rigid, risk-averse oversight. This could stifle innovation, limit diversity of voice, and diminish the fidelity of adaptations, as creative professionals prioritize personal safety over artistic expression. Another aspect of narrative misuse is the framing of intention. The lawsuit repeatedly suggests that Justin Baldoni introduced sexualized scenes for personal motives, namely to pursue Blake Lively. Depositions, however, show that all scenes in question were authored by Christy Hall, adjusted according to studio notes, and moderated by professional oversight. Misrepresenting intent in this way has consequences not only for individuals' reputations, but also for public understanding of professional filmmaking processes. It fosters a culture in which private, professional decisions are presumed to be suspect, undermining trust within creative teams. Public perception is further complicated by the involvement of high-profile actors like Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. Their cultural capital amplifies the reach of the narrative they present, which can overshadow the factual record. In media ecosystems driven by sensationalism, accusations of misconduct attract far more attention than clarifications based on evidence. Consequently, even accurate testimony, deposition records, and corroborating evidence may have limited impact on audience beliefs once a scandalous story has taken root. The interplay between legal strategy and public relations also deserves attention to be why framing standard adaptation discussions and collaborative drafting processes as ethically or legally questionable. The plaintiffs attempt to control the narrative externally while leveraging legal filings internally. This creates a dual mechanism for influence. Court are pressured with claims of wrongdoing, and public opinion is steered by simplified, emotionally charged interpretations of those claims. The ultimate effect is a distortion of professional norms into personal scandal. Industry observers must recognize that these distortions have systemic consequences. Writers, directors, and producers may increasingly avoid sexual or intimate content, even when it is essential to character development, for fear of misinterpretation. Actors may feel compelled to intervene or over-police content to protect themselves from potential accusations, creating a more constrained and risk-averse creative environment. These dynamics can reduce authenticity, compromise storytelling, and disincentivize nuanced portrayals of adult relationships. Furthermore, the case highlights a critical gap in public understanding of film adaptation. Conflating draft proposals, collaborative development, studio notes, and actor input with misconduct simplifies a highly iterative process into a false narrative of predation or coercion. Adaptation inherently involves experimentation, revision, and compromise. Mischaracterizing this process undermines industry standards and can have a chilling effect on creative risk-taking. Another long-term consequence relates to authorship acknowledgement. Christy Hall's contributions, as documented in depositions, are central to the development of dialogue and scene structure. The legal and public narratives that assign responsibilities solely to Justin Baldoni ignore or minimize a role, demonstrating how selective storytelling can erase key contributors. Misattribution of creative work is a persistent issue in Hollywood, and high-profile cases like this one exacerbate the problem. Finally, the broader cultural implication is the weaponization of perception. By framing professional collaboration as misconduct, the plaintiffs establish a precedent for interpreting standard industry practices as ethically suspect whenever high-profile actors are involved. This risks creating an environment in which creative decisions are scrutinized not for artistic or practical merit, but for potential scandal value. In conclusion, the long-term impact of the It Ends With Us adaptation controversy extends beyond individual careers or the outcome of a lawsuit. It raises questions about how fidelity to source material is interpreted and judged, how collaborative creative processes are represented in public and legal discourse, how high-profile actors influence narrative framing, and how misrepresentation of intent can distort industry standards and public perception. Ultimately, the case serves as a cautionary tale. Misrepresenting adaptation processes, misattributing authorship, and weaponizing public perception can have profound consequences, not only for those involved, but for the wider Hollywood ecosystem, future adaptations, and the creative freedom of directors, writers, and actors alike.